Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. 15 minutes and Deputy Ward 5 minutes. Minister, I think today is a very disappointing day for all of us. It's disappointing for a number of reasons. First of all, because we are again being asked to keep on the statute books and keep in use emergency powers, which we all would have hoped would have been long gone. But equally disappointing because of the recommended changes which have come from NPHET, which the Government will obviously have to decide on over the next number of hours and days. And I say that in the context of the public health advice is what it is, and I support public health measures. It's disappointing because it will feel for a lot of people that we're going backwards when we had such a huge uptake of the vaccine rollout, when people have done their absolute best over the last almost 2 years to do what they can to protect themselves and their families. It will feel like this is again a step backwards. And it has to be said, Minister, that there has been two characteristics of your government's approach to COVID, which has again landed us in a situation where you are asking us to give you a blank cheque, your government a blank cheque, extend emergency powers, and the prospect of additional restrictions coming for the hospitality sector, household visits, the use of COVID certs being extended in certain circumstances, and limitations on indoor events. And those two characteristics have been very quick to take away income supports for workers and for families. We've seen that happen again over the last number of days. Far too slow to respond to the measures and supports which the Government can and should put in place to keep people safe and to ensure that the first principles of test, trace, isolate and now vaccinate worked to the extent that they should. And that's the background in which we're having this discussion here today. And I am going to get, Minister, to what I would do, what Sinn Féin would do, which is often what many of your colleagues and you yourself ask when you are on the airwaves in response to our criticisms. The last time we had a debate like this, you accused me and my party of being against public health advice because we were against the extension of emergency powers. And you can't have it both ways, because I fully support public health measures. I fully support the provision of public health measures. I will not oppose them. But what I cannot do is give what I feel is emergency powers to a minister who on several occasions has not got it right. As I said, too slow to respond on occasion, clumsy at times in terms of how you've approached many of the issues, and it has to be said, and I'll put it as bluntly as this, you've made a dog's dinner of some of the responses as well, and all of that I think has created confusion and all of the mixed messages that people have talked about themselves over the last while. And it really creates anger, and it creates resentment, and it creates frustration at a time when people are really tired and really fatigued, and they want to see strong leadership, but they also want to see a coherent response, and they want to see that we are making the right decisions for them. I also believe that they would want the response to be done right, and they would want proper debate, proper scrutiny, proper accountability. I remember when the Merrion Gate story first appeared in the public domain, and what was its characteristic? Confusion. The Taoiseach at the time wasn't aware of the difference between the guidelines and the regulations, and we had all of that. I'm not going to go back over all of that ground. That confusion was created because there wasn't clarity. There was no debate in relation to the regulations. Not even the Taoiseach was aware precisely of what the regulations were to do. And yet you're asking us in this House to give you a blank cheque again, to go away and to make new regulations. I assume, Minister, and I've read the media reports, and again we're going to learn about this in the media. There has been no offer of a briefing to the opposition. I wonder, will we get one over the next number of days? We've again had recommendations which are coming from NPHET, which I support. That's their right. They give public health advice. At times, in more recent times, you and your government have nuanced that public health advice. That's your right as well. It's the government's job to take the advice, put in place measures put in place measures that you believe are the most appropriate. My point in relation to the nuancing of the message is that we are not asked our opinion. We are not part of that discussion or debate. We don't have any hand, act or part in the development or creation of those regulations. They're crafted by you and by our government. As you said, they're published, put on the website. And if I today vote for this bill without any amendment, I'm essentially saying to you, you go away and again make those regulations, again nuance the public health advice in whatever way you see fit, without any debate, without any scrutiny, without any accountability in relation to what people in this House feel. There will be no discussion, no debate whatsoever. And I come from a school of thought that if you get your hand burned on one occasion, you don't put your hand back in the fire again. And that's what happened to us on previous occasions when, in the early stages of this pandemic, when the Dáil wasn't sitting, when it was a real crisis at that point in terms of learning about what this virus was, there was a need to have emergency powers. We're not there at this point because circumstances have changed. There's a difference between that and not needing public health advice or not needing public health measures. Of course we do. But I don't believe we need the level of emergency powers that essentially take the powers away from the Oireachtas, give them to you to go and make regulations, and then we're all held to account. Because if there's any mistake, and there has been many mistakes, I am then asked to account for that in the same way as you are, because it would be rightly pointed out to us. You voted for us. You gave the Minister for Health those powers. You surrendered the accountability and the transparency, and I simply can't do that, Minister. We've tabled a number of amendments, which again I feel are reasonable amendments, and they were very similar to the amendments that we debated last night in a different bill. It requires that the regulations made under the Acts would require the approval of the Houses of the Oireachtas. And again, we were pragmatic to say, in circumstances where it's urgent, that the Joint Committee on Health could give approval of the Houses following as soon as is possible. So the Minister could make the regulations, but then would need retrospective approval from the House afterwards. That it would require a report reviewing the use, functions and impact of the provisions of the Acts at least 2 weeks before a proposed extension. And it would mandate reporting of COVID-19 infections in the workplace and many more amendments. I'm assuming that other members of the opposition will also table very similar amendments as they did yesterday. But if you don't accept those amendments, Minister, then we're back to a situation where it is a blank cheque to you and your government. That's where we will end up, and I think that is really problematic. So if we look at what is being proposed by NPHET, and again, I can only go on what's in the public domain, I think it is back to front that this advice is published even before the government makes any decision. There's all this speculation about what it means. We're asked our view. The government, there's radio silence for a couple of days from the government. Then the government makes a decision, and then we have to react to a government decision without any engagement whatsoever with anybody else in the Oireachtas. That's what happens. But let's look at what's been proposed. So in terms of hospitality, 6 per table, no multiple bookings, table service only, and a curfew at 11:30. I'm assuming all of that will have to be done by way of new regulations. Nightclubs essentially will be closed for all intents and purposes. How else could you read the advice which is being given? Live venues will have a 50% seating capacity only. Household visits will be reduced to 4, including the host household per home. Extension of the COVID certs to gyms and hotels. Again, I assume that would require regulation. Indoor events, 50% capacity for cultural, entertainment, community and sporting events. Again, I'm assuming all of that would require regulation. If it requires regulation, Minister, I don't know what provisions in terms of the advice which has been given that your Cabinet will sign off on. I have no idea. Maybe you'll accept all of them. Maybe you won't. Maybe you may not go the full distance in relation to the 11:30 curfew. Who knows? And we have to wait and see what the government does, which is precisely my point. We vote for this, the Cabinet goes off, makes a decision, you make the regulations, they don't come back to this House, and our view is immaterial. And yet, we're then held to account in the same way that you are. I have no doubt whatsoever, Minister, that if you were standing where I am, you would see the difficulty that places me in and many other members of the opposition. So when you talk about appealing to people to vote for this legislation, at least make a distinction between that and supporting emergency powers and supporting public health advice. Because I have been very, very clear right through this pandemic that public health advice has to be heeded, public health advice has to be supported. It's the job of the public health experts to give advice to government, and yes, on occasion there can be nuancing of that for practical reasons, because that's the job of government, to look at a whole of society response, and I get that, and we obviously have done that on occasion as well. But as close as is possible, We have stuck to the public health advice because that's the right thing to do. These are experts that give advice. We can't change it. It is what it is, but then we have to make decisions. But we don't make the decisions. You make the decisions, Minister. And I want to go back then to some of the issues where the government has failed and fallen down in recent times. Antigen testing. There has been some movement on antigen testing, and I welcome it. So unlike some others, I actually welcome the fact that antigen testing is now being used in relation to travel for people who are vaccinated. I think that's appropriate, and I think that's an appropriate use of antigen testing. But it can be made free and accessible. That's a decision that your government could make. We're going to make antigen testing free and accessible, and there will be a really strong communication campaign around how people should use it, in what circumstances they should, and in what circumstances they should not. And then we hardwire antigen testing into our overall response. That wasn't done. That was a failure of government. Ventilation is something that we have talked about time and again. Sorry, just wait for... Ventilation is something that we've talked about time and again in schools and in workplaces. And again, Minister, your government has dragged its feet. We had expert groups on antigen testing, and for far too long the government ignored the advice from the advisory panel on antigen testing. We had an expert group on ventilation. The government binned the reports, absolutely just binned the reports, did not listen whatsoever. We had people resign from that group, people who were on the group who were quite critical of the fact that we haven't responded. It is absolutely flabbergasting to people that we're again at a point when more restrictions are being considered and we haven't done what we need to do in relation to ventilation in schools and workplaces. Look at the ICU capacity in our hospitals. Again, you flunked that one, and we don't have the capacity that's needed. Contact tracing in schools was ended. We went from this bizarre situation where schools were the safest environment you could possibly imagine. We don't need contact tracing, we don't need air circulation or ventilation, none of that was necessary, and all of a sudden, the one cohort of the population that were unvaccinated, the government said, no, they are the problem. Finally accepted that measures had to be taken in schools. And what did you do? Mask wearing, which is the public health advice, but none of the other issues in relation to contact tracing and ventilation, and you have children freezing in schools because windows were open. That's the level of frustration that principals and teachers and parents have. You took away the supports for workers and for families, a 40% reduction in the EWSS scheme, a sliding scale reduction in the PUP payment. If you look at the booster jab rollout, you reduced the capacity in terms of the capacity that was previously there in the summer, Minister, when the vaccines were being rolled out. That capacity was scaled down, and we're now not rolling out the booster jab as quickly as we can. And that's the central problem here, Minister. So I'm going to finish my contribution by just reminding you of a number of things. If you want the support of the opposition, you have to work with them. We have to be part of the solution. It has to come into the Dáil for decisions to be made. You brought forward a bill last night through primary legislation in relation to mandatory hotel quarantine. We had proper debate and proper scrutiny, and we supported it. I cannot support the emergency powers bill as it is, Minister, if the amendments are not taken. And I have to say, I cannot understand why the amendments are not being taken. I know amendments will be tabled, I'm sure, by the Labour Party, by the Social Democrats, by others who have tabled similar amendments. And it's really frustrating for us, and I said this last night, to hear you time and again say, well, we will change, we will engage with the opposition, there will be briefings, there will be discussion, and yet I haven't been informed of any briefing flowing from NEFID's recommendations, which end up in the public domain. We're all being asked. I've been invited on to media programmes, I'm sure others in the opposition, and we're speculating in the dark. We can only go on what's in the media, and I assume that we won't be briefed for the next number of days if we get briefed at all. And yet you expect us then just to give you a blank cheque to go and put in place whatever regulations you like. So your inability to respond quickly, you've been too slow to respond in too many areas, the clumsy approach of this government far too often, and I think the dog's dinner that has been made of so many of the regulations and guidelines in the past, and the confusion that even tripped up your own government ministers, is not something that I want to see continue, and it's not something that I'm going to support. So I very much hope, Minister, that the amendments will be accepted. I know we're in a difficult situation. This is difficult for everybody. It's difficult for all of the workers and families out there who will be listening to the news later and watching the recommendations in terms of the changes which are coming. And none of these are easy for anybody. Some people will lose their jobs. Some businesses are going to feel all of that. But I think there's a real frustration out there that while all of this is happening, the government is not getting it right in so many places. And I'm simply not going to give you or this government, Minister, any blank cheque.